Dearborn, Michigan. The winter of 1969. On a finance floor inside Ford World headquarters, the light through the green glass is the color of dishwater, and somewhere in that building, a man in a white shirt is working a problem with a pencil. We do not know his name. Ford never published his page, and that matters, so hold on to that. The arithmetic itself is not in dispute. On one side, what Ford will charge for a Mustang. $4,798. On the other side, an engine built to racing tolerances in numbers too small for the tooling to ever pay for itself, and a body that has to be trucked out to a job shop and rebuilt by hand before that engine will fit. He runs the total twice. The number at the bottom of the page is bigger than the number at the top. At any other company, a page like that kills a car. Not this one. The man who ordered it sits in the president's office, and he does not want a profitable Mustang. This is the story of the Boss 429, not the engine exactly, the bill. Ford did not build this car to make money selling Mustangs. Ford built it to buy a rule, and it set the sticker price knowing full well the sticker would never cover the car. It is also the story of a General Motors man who walked into Dearborn, went to war with Chrysler, and was gone in 19 months. And it finishes with a Mustang crossing an auction block for more than $1 million. To understand why any Ford president would sign that page, you have to understand what Chrysler had already done to him. On December 6, 1963, a new Chrysler racing engine ran for the first time. 400 to 26 cubic inches with hemispherical combustion chambers, domed roofs over each cylinder that breathed better than anything else Detroit had on a shelf. The following February, Richard Petty won his first Daytona 500 with one under the hood. That was not a race. It was a demonstration. NASCAR changed the rules. For the 1965 season, the Hemi was outlawed because it was a pure racing engine and no human being could walk into a Dodge store and buy one. Chrysler packed up and sat out most of a year. Then Chrysler did the thing that rewired the American car business. In 1966, it put the Hemi in the showroom. 425 horsepower, SAE gross, in a car your neighbor could finance. Hardly anybody checked that box on an order form, and that did not matter. The engine's job in a showroom was never to sell cars. Its job was to be countable. That is homologation, one of the strangest ideas ever written into a rule book. Race whatever you like, the rule says, as long as you are willing to sell it to the public. Real dealerships, real customers, real paper. In 1969, the number NASCAR wanted was 500. Ford, meanwhile, had run out of road. The 427 had won the company a great many trophies, but the engine family behind it dated to the late 1950s. Ford's most exotic answer, the overhead cam version Detroit called the Cammer, died by the same rule that killed the race Hemi. Ford needed a clean sheet and 500 customers willing to take delivery of the thing. What it got, in February of 1968, was a man from General Motors. His name was Seaman Emil Knudsen, though nobody ever called him that. He was Bunkie. His father ran General Motors as its president, and when the war came, Franklin Roosevelt made him a lieutenant general and put him in charge of American production. At Pontiac, the son took a division that built cars for people who had given up, stripped the chrome streaks off the hood, pushed the wheels out toward the fenders for that wide track stance, and pointed it at the racetrack. By the end of the 1950s, Pontiac was third in the American car business. General Motors moved him to Chevrolet, then made him an executive vice president. One job was left. He did not get it. The board handed the presidency to Ed Cole. 29 years, 2 divisions turned around, his father's portrait on the wall, and the answer was no. Knudsen resigned on the last day of January, 1968. The phone rang within days. It was Henry Ford II, and on February 6th, he made Bunkie Knudsen president of the Ford Motor Company. To make room, the sitting president was moved sideways, a finance executive who had come up through the accounting side of the building. Read that sequence slowly. Ford Motor Company took the accountant out of the president's office and put a racer in it. If you enjoy the corporate knife fights as much as the quarter-mile times, take a second and subscribe, because what this man did next is one of the strangest business decisions of the muscle car era, and he had 8 months left in the job by the time the first car was built. The money tells you how badly Henry Ford II wanted him. According to Time magazine, Knudsen was paid $580,952 a year. The average American household that year was living on around $8,547. One man in that building took the news very badly. Lee Iacocca had put the Mustang on the road, and he had been the obvious heir to the whole company until the morning the announcement went out. A Ford executive later described his position to Time this way: Lee had chewed his way through 10 layers of management to get where he was, and he was determined to chew his way through anyone who was placed above him. The engine waiting for Knudsen was a racing engine that happened to be legal for the street rather than the other way around. 4-bolt main bearing caps, connecting rods built to NASCAR specification with half-inch bolts. 429 cubic inches under a pair of aluminum cylinder heads with shallow semi-hemispherical chambers. The ports were big enough that the men who worked on them started calling it the shotgun motor. Ford rated it at 375 horsepower and 450 pounds-feet of torque. Hold that number lightly. Every American horsepower figure in 1969 was SAE gross, measured with no accessories and no exhaust in the way, and published testing of stock engines has come in lower than the advertised number. In race trim, the same engine was worth well over 550. That gap is the whole point. The street version was deliberately strangled with a mild camshaft, a modest carburetor, and a smog pump. Ford was not selling anybody a race engine. Ford was selling the paperwork that made the race engine legal, with a car wrapped around it. Then came the decision that turned a difficult program into an impossible one. The car Ford was going to race was not a Mustang at all. It was the Torino Talladega, and the obvious move was to sell the new engine in the car that would actually be racing. Knudsen said no, he wanted it in the Mustang. The reasoning was not stupid. Mustang was the name that moved metal, the car on every teenager's bedroom wall in America. But the Torino's engine bay was wide, and the Mustang's was not. Those aluminum heads made the Boss 429 one of the widest engines in Detroit, and the shock towers sat exactly where the heads needed to be. The front structure of the car was in the way, so Ford rebuilt the front of every single one by hand. Bodies came down the Dearborn line and were pulled off before the powertrain went in, then trucked to a specialty shop in Brighton, Michigan, where the shock towers came out and were replaced with pieces spread further apart, and the battery moved to the trunk. Hold on to one thing because we come back to it. The Mustang was never the race car. Ford was rebuilding automobiles by hand to make an engine legal for a body it was not going into. Now run the arithmetic our man on the finance floor was running. Most sources put the 1969 run somewhere between 857 and 859 cars, and 1970 at 499. Call it around 1,350 for the whole program. Dearborn was turning out more Mustangs than that in a day and a half. Against all of it sits the number from the top of the page, the one that cannot move because the market will not let it move. $4,798. That sticker made it the most expensive Mustang in the building outside of a Shelby, roughly double the price of a base sports roof. Ford could not ask for more because a Mustang much past $5,000 in 1969 has left the Mustang market entirely. Ford could not build it cheaper either because the whole reason the car existed was that it could not be built cheaply. The loss was not a mistake. It was designed into the program on the day somebody said the word Mustang. Now, about that loss. You will hear numbers. Figures for what Ford dropped on every Boss 429 have been repeated in magazines and forums for 50 years, and I am not going to hand you one of them as though it came out of a ledger, because I cannot show you the ledger. Ford never published a per-unit cost for this car, and the figures that circulate in the hobby do not trace back to any accounting document. What we can trace is everything around it. The published price, the hand conversion, the tiny volume, the outside shop. Sports Car Market, which has audited collector car transactions for decades, puts it plainly and without a dollar figure. Because of the cost of the conversion, Ford took a loss on each car. What made it worse is that the car was not even the fastest thing in the showroom. Quarter miles landed right around 14 seconds flat. A Mach 1 with the 428 Cobra jet was rated at 335 horsepower gross and ran the same territory, sometimes better, for well over $1,000 less. 72,458 people bought a Mach 1 in 1969, and a good number of them beat Boss 429s on Woodward without ever knowing what they had just done. So what did all of that money actually buy? One season, a very good one, but one. Ford put the engine into competition in the spring of 1969, dropped into Torino Talladegas and Mercury Cyclones, and it worked immediately. That NASCAR Grand National season ran 54 races. Ford took 25 of them, and Mercury took 3 more, which means the corporation that had just built itself a hand assembled Mustang to satisfy a paperwork requirement, won more than half the schedule. Dodge won 25. Plymouth won 1. David Pearson, driving for Holman and Moody, took the championship with 11 victories in 51 starts and more laps completed in a single season than anyone had ever run to that point. The Boss 429 engine has been credited by multiple accounts with 26 wins that year, though the counts differ depending on who is doing the counting and how they attribute the Mercuries. Ford spent the money, and Ford won. And the Mustang, the car that made the whole thing legal, the one rebuilt by hand in Brighton at a loss on every unit, never turned a competitive lap in NASCAR. Not one. Ford homologated the engine separately from the body, so it went racing in Torinos and Cyclones, while the Mustang that justified it sat in showrooms and driveways, doing absolutely nothing for the racing program except existing. That was its entire job, to exist. 1,300 and some automobiles built for no reason other than to be counted. Then the sport ended the argument. Having watched 4 manufacturers spend themselves stupid on long noses and tall wings, NASCAR regulated every one of the aero cars out of competition by the close of the 1970 season. Ford had paid a fortune for a permission slip, and the sanctioning body tore it up before the engine was old. Meanwhile, the Halo car in the corner of the showroom, wearing all that racing legitimacy, moved fewer than 900 units in its best year. And the 1970 Mustang sold worse than the 1969 cars had. You can argue all night about whether racing sells cars. You cannot argue about whether this one sold. On September 11, 1969, Bunkie Knudsen was fired. He had been president of the Ford Motor Company for 19 months. Henry Ford II offered the press almost nothing, and the little he offered has been repeated in Detroit ever since. Things did not work out as I had hoped they might. The chairman named no replacement. He split the company into operating groups and put Lee Iacocca at the head of the most important one, exactly where Iacocca had expected to be all along. The car outlived the man who ordered it by about 15 months. The 1970 version got solid lifters and loud new colors with names like Grabber Orange and Grabber Green. 499 were built, and the program was canceled after the model year. On November 25, 1970, a Ford vice president named Matthew McLaughlin announced that Ford Motor Company was withdrawing from all forms of racing. Racing money that had run near $12 million a year at the peak of the Ferrari era collapsed to roughly $2 million. What survived was a tip, $2,000 a race toward a pit crew, and good luck to you. The 426 Hemi, the engine this whole exercise was built to beat, went on to win the next 3 championships. Bobby Isaac took 1970 in a Dodge. Richard Petty took 1971 and 1972 in a Plymouth. Ford got 1 season. Chrysler got the decade. The Mustangs themselves did something almost no muscle car did. They survived. The men who owned them knew they had something that would not be built again, so they parked them and kept the paperwork in a drawer. Market trackers now put the benchmark value for one of these near $380,000. And that is not a record. That is the ordinary going rate. In June of 2026, at the first Barrett-Jackson sale ever held in Columbus, Ohio, an unrestored 1969 car with 4,435 original miles crossed the block with no reserve. Auction market records put the result at a little over $1 million. Ford Motor Company did not build the Boss 429 to make money. It built it to buy a rule, and it set the price, knowing the price would never cover the car. That was not a failure of the program. That was the program. The man with the pencil was right, and it did not matter because this was never an argument about profit. It was an argument about Chrysler. Nobody does that now, and the men who were 17 when one went past them on a summer night have never forgotten the sound. So tell me where you stand, Ford or Mopar, the shotgun motor or the Hemi. And if you ever saw a real one back when it was just an expensive used car nobody understood, tell me where you were standing.